Hello, LinguaFolio online users, and welcome to our first module on ongoing assessment. Our focus today will be on the first step in using LinguaFolio online in your classrooms in order to give students rapid, meaningful, and consistent feedback. That step is carefully designing a final unit assessment. In creating a final unit assessment, we must consider various stages in the LinguaFolio online cycle. Mostly, we are focusing on designing a task, in this case the final unit assessment, to meet the targets defined by the goals that we already set in the goal setting module and the related can-do statements. Before we get into the meat of today's discussion, here is an overview of what we will be covering. The first topic is creating the final unit assessment. Next, we will discuss identifying a rubric to go along with the assessment, and finally, we will discuss how to make the rubric student-friendly. An important component of making rubrics student-friendly for LinguaFolio online users is connecting the rubric clearly to can-do statements. Before beginning a unit of study, you must create your final unit assessment. The first step in creating your final unit assessment is to pick a big can-do statement from the desired mode of communication on the necessful actful list. Step 2 is to design your assessment with a realistic context. Also, make sure that your assessment is connected to the concept or concepts that you are teaching. These concepts are discussed in greater detail in our goal setting module. Step 3 is to decide which sub-can-do statements will be reflected in your assessment. And finally, step 4 is to communicate the assessment with your students at the beginning of a unit of study. This communication articulates the pathway to knowledge building that students will need to follow. In case you are unfamiliar with the necessful actful can-do statements, here is an example of the various functions of language that would be expected out of a student of novice high proficiency in presentational writing. As you see, there are various statements in bold. These statements are what we have dubbed to be the big can-do statements. The statements beneath the big can-do statements are the sub-can-do statements. Essentially, in order to successfully achieve the task defined in a big can-do statement, students should be able to successfully achieve the tasks of all of the sub-can-do statements as well. This is an example of a strong final unit assessment. As you can see, the big can-do statement of I can write information about my daily life in a letter, blog, discussion board, or email message has been selected to go along with the assessment. The assessment contains two major components and one follow-up discussion. The first component requires that students create 2 social media profiles under fake names. The first social media profile should reflect the student's true identity other than the name, and the second social media profile contains only information that has been made up. After the class gets the chance to review all of the social media profiles, each student is to pick a new friend and to send that friend an email or a letter. In the introductory correspondence, the students are to describe themselves, their friends, their family members, and explain other basic information about themselves, including their likes and their dislikes. In the follow-up discussion, students will reveal if the identities chosen for the letters were real or fake. The students will then discuss the interplay of perception and reality. Perception and reality are the 2 concepts that were chosen to teach this unit. Now that we have decided what our final unit assessment will be, we need to pick a rubric to use to evaluate students on that final assessment. This is the rubric that was designed by Castles to go along with our assessment. It was made to assess the presentational communication skills of novice language learners by using the Actual Performance Descriptors for Language Learners released in 2012. While it is fine to use this rubric for your own purposes, it is not necessary. Please use the rubric that best reflects the expectations that exist in your school or school district. Essentially, on this rubric, a 7-8 student is an emerging intermediate communicator. A 5-6 student would be a novice high communicator. A 3-4 student would be a novice mid communicator, and a 1-2 student would be a novice low communicator. At this juncture, it is important to emphasize two best practices that should be used when giving final unit assessments. The first is that of beginning with the end in mind. The final unit assessment should be ready to go before teaching the unit. Once the unit does begin, share this assessment and its associated rubric and expectations with students. This communication is especially necessary for novice learners. We don't want to surprise them with our assessment, and they should be able to see why every activity in class is relevant and how it relates to the meaningful communication that is expected of them on the unit's final assessment. In no way does this preparation for the students mean that teachers should focus solely on teaching to the test and ignoring other relevant and important components of classwork and student practice. It does mean, however, that teachers must give students the opportunity to complete practice activities that mirror the rigor that is expected of them on final unit assessments and provide students with feedback on those activities. The next best practice that we should discuss is to move away from using percentages. If you'll note on the previous rubric, possible scores range from 0 to 8. According to the descriptors, a student who scores a 4 is a solid student and performs at an average level. However, if I calculated the student's score as a 4 out of 8, that student would receive a 50%, which in most school districts is a failing grade. That grade is a complete disservice to the student. Not only does it serve to demotivate the student for future activities, but it also is not reflective of what the student knows. Thus, when creating a rubric like the one that I have on the previous slide, make sure to create a conversion scale to go along with it. Here is an example of a conversion scale to use with the rubric that I created. With this conversion, a 7-8 student would earn an A 5-6 student would earn a B, a 3-4 student would earn a C, a 2 student would earn a D, and a 1 student would earn a high F. Clearly, a 0 student would earn an F as well. When creating this conversion scale for yourself, keep your school district's rules for grading in mind. It is best to use the scale department-wide, and even better to work in a cross-curricular fashion and have a whole team of teachers from different subject areas using the same conversion scale for similar rubrics. Okay, now that we have our final unit assessment, our rubric, and our conversion scale, we're ready to take steps to make our rubric just a little more student-friendly. It is easy to think that in creating a rubric, we are clearly outlining expectations of students. However, the language that is used in those rubrics tends to be a bit vague, and some students, especially those who are highly effective, do not understand what it is that they are supposed to do. Any steps that we can take as educators to break down the language of the rubric are steps in the right direction. The first step in making rubrics student-friendly is to develop indicators. Indicators are basically statements that crystallize for students what exactly it is that you, as their teacher, are looking for at a given proficiency level. Please notice that no indicator is repeated among descriptors. It is therefore assumed that students who are achieving at a 7-8 level have evidence of all of the indicators listed at proficiency levels below their achievement as well. When you are grading, you will simply make check marks next to each indicator that is represented in the indicator column. Whatever achievement level you are in when you stop making check marks is what the student's grade will be. This approach is advantageous for a variety of reasons. First, it saves time for teachers. Not only does it make grading much faster because teachers no longer have to spend time bean counting and taking off a prescribed amount of points for certain types of errors, but it also allows for rubrics to be used on multiple assessments. Instead of changing the rubric, teachers only have to edit the indicators to match new expectations of content mastery. Secondly, it's much more holistic, and teachers are more likely to arrive at an accurate representation of a student's proficiency level using this method. Also, it allows students to be certain of exactly what it is that they were missing and need to improve upon before taking subsequent assessments. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, the language used in creating indicators is always positive and emphasizes what the students have mastered as opposed to what the students haven't mastered. This approach in assessment feedback is more motivating than one in which all of the students' deficiencies are emphasized. So that you can read them more easily, here's a slide that includes only the indicators from our example rubric. It is very important to go over these indicators at the beginning of a unit of study with students so as to provide them with a map of where the unit of study is taking them. An equally important practice is to stop creating the indicators yourself after the students are accustomed to working with them. Instead, create them in concert with students. Have the students discuss what their various expectations should be and why those expectations should exist. If the students are able to participate in this discussion, you can be confident that they understand how to construct complete messages and how to communicate meaningfully and pragmatically. As we have already mentioned, grading with indicators expedites the evaluation process. Teachers are able to work with a checklist, and what is equally beneficial is that students are able to work with that same checklist before turning in an assessment. Thus, there should be no surprises when a student receives his or her grade. This process usually goes quite easily. However, you may have a student who has indicators that are all over the map. Maybe the student's work shows evidence of one of the 1-2 indicators, none of the 3-4 indicators, half of the 5-6 indicators, and one of the 7-8 indicators. If this situation happens to you, please use a best fit approach when determining the final grade for your student. Like a puzzle piece fits perfectly into its place on the puzzle, you want to make sure that your scores perfectly reflect the proficiency levels of your students. Our last step in making a rubric student-friendly is to identify and communicate what can-do statements are relevant to that final unit assessment.
Here you see an example of a rubric that I would give my students on the first day of a unit. Not only does it include descriptors, but it also includes the indicators and the related can-do statements.
This slide shows only the can-do statements on our example rubric. As was the case with indicators, these can-do statements build progressively as students show increased levels of proficiency. At a 1-2 level, the student is likely only using linguistic chunks and can introduce his or herself. That's about it. At a 3-4 level, however, the student is also able to describe his or herself and can say what he or she is like, what he or she looks like, and what he or she does. At the 5-6 level, it's important for students to start inquiring about others. So that student must also be able to ask basic questions. And at the 7-8 level, we expect students to also be able to describe family and friends. Providing students with can-do statements in this format is beneficial for a variety of reasons. First, the statements help students to connect the content that they are learning with the various functions of language. Students essentially have a checklist of abilities that they know that they need to showcase in order to do well. Also, after completing an assessment, students are able to easily use it as evidence for the relevant can-do statements on Linguafolio. We have now reached the end of Part 1 of the ongoing assessment module for Linguafolio Online. This training module was funded by the U.S. Department of Education under grant number P229A14004. Contents do not necessarily represent the policy of the U.S. Department of Education, nor imply endorsement by the federal government. If you have any questions about what you saw in today's module, please do not hesitate to contact us at lfolio@uoregon.edu. Thank you.